So the brain, is composed of cells, right? Like all body tissues. The cell doctrine applies, it turns out, to the brain as well. The cells are, quite remarkable and varied. They don't look, like our sort of, textbook idea of a cell, right? With just a spherical, kind of membrane-bound structure. They're actually much more complicated, right? They have all sorts of, projections off them, etc. This is an example of a neuron, composed of pipe cleaners. But in the brain, you got 86 billion of these, but you've also got another 86 billion, what are called glial cells. These are sort of what used to be, conceptualized as sort of support cells for the neurons, which really were carrying out all the, critical, functional activity of the brain. But it turns out that the glial cells play a pretty significant role also in how our neurons, function and how our brains function and how they can actually contribute to information processing the same way a lot of these neurons can as well. So we're learning a lot more about both neurons and glia. And again, 86 billion of these in the adult, right? 86 billion more glial cells in the adult. But you all started with about 200 billion, neurons, just the neurons actually in your brains as an infant. And then, life happens, right, or continues to happen, and you're going to lose, a great many of these. We, go from 200 billion neurons down to 86 billion neurons, in the adult. We like to say K-12 education, takes away more than half of your brain. But the connections that are going to form, to allow, afferent detection, right, of your sensory world and distribution through these networks that develop with experience, and then out ultimately to motor or efferent, projections that can move muscles and get you to, speak and move and, emote and behave. You're going to hone down those networks with experience to those that are going to be, prove most effective and useful typically, in your, specific environment. I find this really quite fascinating though, because we go to a lot of schools and, make brain cells in schools and talk to a lot of adolescents and a lot of, elementary and middle school students. And what's fascinating is the adult brain with a more finely honed kind of network, right? With the frontal lobe, kind of experienced in the environments in which it developed, specifically jump to a lot of conclusions, engage in a lot of biased sort of behavior, that isn't necessarily the whole story at all, in different circumstances, or even in the circumstances in which they find themselves, you find yourself. And young people, have brains that are, still under significant, development, going from the 200 billion neurons and those networks, honing them down to their own adult 86 billion, 100 trillion synaptic connections. So they often note the hypocrisy of the adult who's jumping to conclusions and missing, a lot of what's actually occurring in a particular environment. So these neurons, though, are just remarkable because, again, they have these, projections off of a cell body. So there is a spherical, kind of, rounded cell-like component that looks like a, standard cell here called the cell body. It's kind of tucked in the middle here amongst all these projections. And, there's a nucleus in the cell body. The cell body is also called the soma. It's a fancy, kind of designation for cell body. The nucleus is here. This is where a lot of protein synthesis, is going to occur. It'll occur other parts of the neuron as well. But the neuron cell body is a really important kind of housekeeping for the whole structure, kind of aspect of a neuron, functional aspect of a neuron. And this I'm showing you right here, by the way, is just like a classic neuron you'd see an image of. But there are so many different shapes and sizes. In fact, we have neurons in our nervous system, in our body, that begin in our toes, for example, and it's the same membrane-bound structure with a cell body hanging off your spinal cord here in a what they call a ganglion again, right, in the peripheral nervous system, and then another projection that's working its way all the way up to the brainstem. So you can have, neurons that are like 5 feet long, And these same kinds of cells exist in a giraffe. So, you can have pretty extensive, individual cells. So there's a remarkable, diversity of form and function. So the soma is the cell body right in the middle here. And then all of these branch-like projections that are coming off are referred to by the Greek word for branch. And this is actually, they're called dendrites. So these are the dendrites, all these projections here. And these dendrites really expand the amount of surface area that's available on a single neuron like this so that you can have many, many more synaptic connections, actually. And we'll see like that during development, for example, there's huge elaboration. Neurons reach out to each other at certain developmental stages, and there's a lot of the synaptogenesis, growth of new synaptic connections, et cetera. And then that's typically followed by significant what we call pruning, right? Where, the specific, connections that are useful, as you're developing, that, that actually permit you to engage in effective, kind of behavior in response to stimuli in your environment, are get preserved, and others will go, including actually entire neurons get, you lose them because they're not effective, they're not useful. So we're going to go through these, these processes of extensive arborization, reaching out more dendrites and more connectivity, more kinds of synaptic connections, and then followed by significant pruning with experience till we hone down those networks, that allow us to behave the most effectively in our environments. So cell body, soma, right? Cellular upkeep, nucleus is here, DNA is here, chromosomes are here, a lot of protein synthesis happening here. Lots of these dendritic projections. These are the inputs, from other neurons that are going to be making synaptic connections onto these dendrites here. They're going to be releasing neurotransmitter that's going to be received, by, these dendrites, and sometimes they'll promote excitation of the neuron. It's going to send an electrical message. Other times it'll inhibit the neuron. And, other times actually, the neurotransmitter that's released and the amount of activity at a particular synapse is going to generate changes in the actual physical structure and thus function of those synapses, and of this particular connection in these vast, neuronal networks that make up who we are. And so at the beginning of this sort of wire-like projection, this wire-like projection here off a, classical neuron is called the axon. This is going to carry the electrical message, what we call an action potential, away from the cell body towards what they call the axon terminals here, the ends of the axon. Right at the very beginning here is a bulge or a little hill of the axon called the axon hillock. And this axon hillock is where a decision is made, depending on the particular, kinds of environmental, aspects at that hillock. This neuron will send an electrical current, a message, like a current working its way down to the end, to the synapses that it makes with other cells, or it won't. So the axon is carrying the electrical message under certain circumstances away from the cell body towards the terminals. And at the terminals, right, they're going to make another synaptic connection with another neuron here, like let's say the dendrites of the next neuron. There's going to be the conversion of that electrical message into the release of a chemical called a neurotransmitter that can then influence activity in the next cell, right? So these neurons are just remarkable, cells that allow for the transfer of information. And, I want to talk about how a single neuron, is not a happy neuron. They like to reach out and connect and form what we refer to as neural networks. And it's incredible how even a very simple network can accomplish rather complex kinds of sensory and motor kind of responses. So just as an example, like a simple kind of neural network, one neuron hooked up to another neuron, hooked up to another neuron, might involve something like a reflexive response. Like you could have a neuron, you will have a neuron out here in your fingertip, right? Part of a neuron here that can respond to, let's say, injury. Like if you cut cells, you burst their cell membranes and you spill their contents, you've got special kinds of neurons out here that can actually bind the chemicals that have been released from your damaged cells. Like if you crush something or cut something, and then they will initiate a current that'll run along their length. This is one neuron, one sensory neuron, right? One neuron carrying afferent information, from the periphery of the body, from the fingertip, what was just injured, into the spinal cord, right? It'll be up here. And then it'll make a connection with a neuron that's inside the central nervous system, right? It'll be a synaptic connection. This is the one sending it in, and this is now it's going to go to this neuron that's completely inside your CNS in the spinal cord. It's called an interneuron. Inter means between, so it's the neuron between the sensory or the afferent input, and then another neuron will then go right back out to your arm, right? And it'll get you to move back, to pull away in a reflexive withdrawal response. That's a protective response. It's a useful response, a behaviorally relevant response. This is an efferent neuron, the one that's going out to move the muscle. So I've only described a network that has a very few neurons, and it's a little more complex because in addition to stimulating one efferent output, right, to pull you back, you also have to inhibit another one. So there are a few more neurons involved, but it's a pretty simple neural network that can actually accomplish a tremendous amount. So I just want to give you a little sense of the power of these individual cells that can carry messages, right, and communicate with others when they are linked up into networks. And we're going to see that when we get to the brain, we have far more extensive, kind of interneuronal networks that can be processing and distributing and, mapping aspects of, afferent input and, potential, sort of scenarios and, behavioral responses.